I'm Dr. Sam Poyser and I work at Aberystwyth University in the Department of Law and Criminology, and I'm going to talk to you today about the following. We're going to look at what is a miscarriage of justice. We're going to look at some of the causes of miscarriages of justice, and then the impacts of miscarriages of justice. And so, yeah, I lecture in criminology within the department, so I lecture on all of the criminology programs. And I've been researching miscarriages of justice for the last 20 or so years. And much of my research really has involved talking to victims of miscarriages of justice. So, for example, somebody who is innocent, or at least claims to be innocent, of a crime for which they've been convicted and spent many years in prison. And usually in my particular research, that crime is murder. Okay, so with that in mind, that being my research area, I run a module on this topic within the department, which students coming onto our programs can choose to take. So that's kind of me and why you're learning a little bit about miscarriages of justice from Aberystwyth University's point of view today. So one of the first things I want to ask you, straight into the questions to you, if you don't mind, is what is a miscarriage of justice? I want you to have a think for a minute or so, and then perhaps type it in the chat or however you want to respond. I'd like to know what you think a miscarriage of justice is, please.
Fantastic, thank you, Sam. Yeah, so have a think about it. Pop it into your thoughts into the chat. If you are happy to use the microphone, most of you look like you're using the chat, but if you are happy to use the mic, feel free to open it up and suggest something. But yeah, we'll look out for any thoughts that you have in the chat.
So you can think as broadly as you want to on this point, or as narrowly, whatever comes straight off the top of your head.
Yeah, so Annie is suggesting prosecuting someone to later find out they're innocent of the crime. Stanley is saying it's when somebody is convicted when they are actually innocent. Meredith, when someone doesn't receive the justice they deserve after being the victim of a crime. Mia is saying or suggesting, there's quite a few actually now, I might have to go back to the bottom, but when a person is convicted or punished for a crime they did not commit. Jessica, when an innocent person is wrongly convicted. So yeah, lots of themes here. Reese Heath saying when a person is innocent but is sent to prison for a crime they did not commit, e.g. The Man from World's Toughest Prisons on Netflix.
Yes.
So one of the students in Reese Heath there. Rachel, I'm jumping a bit here, but when someone is accused and prosecutes someone for a crime they didn't do. And Casey, when someone is punished by the court of law for a crime they haven't committed. So the theme is sort of common themes there, Sam, but back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. But I did hear an answer in there, which was the flip side of the coin. So the most obvious side is for example, somebody who's innocent of a crime and was convicted of that crime, however. But the flip side of the coin is the victim side of the story. So perhaps somebody has been murdered and their family is seeking justice and they haven't got justice. So they will see that as a miscarriage of justice as well. That was really good. Well done, everybody. So there we go. So yeah, there are many different forms of miscarriages of justice, and that's something that I'm going to talk about for a few moments. So traditionally, when we think about miscarriages of justice, we think about wrongful convictions, okay? So some of the things that you've been saying. And so traditionally, we're thinking about an innocent person who's been convicted of a crime that obviously, therefore, they didn't commit. It's really important before we go on to understand that in quashing a conviction, the Court of Appeal, which you can see here, does not refer to innocence. So simply, 3 judges at the Court of Appeal will look at your case that you're putting before them, which essentially says, perhaps, I'm innocent, I didn't do this, and yet I've been convicted of it. And if they decide that the fresh evidence that you're putting forward to suggest that stands, then they'll say, okay, well, the conviction is unsafe. So there's never a declaration of innocence in that regard, and that's something that's really important to keep in mind, despite the fact that we all associate it with innocence, okay? So If they decide, well, no, it's not, it can stand, then the conviction will stand and you'll remain in prison, okay? But the key thing to keep in mind is that notion of innocence and how it fits and sits very uncomfortably with innocence. So, but in layman's terms, we think of miscarriages of justice and innocence as, for example, these sorts of levels, where it's impossible, looking back on a conviction, for the person to have committed the crime. And that's usually because years down the line, the real culprit is discovered. Okay, so a conviction is quashed, and then a few years later, maybe the real culprit is discovered. Then another level, weighing up all the evidence, it's highly unlikely. For example, something went wrong at the trial, maybe the judge gave a biased summing up, and that sort of conviction would be quashed, okay, so it'd be seen as unsafe, but they had the right person. So you might say, oh, hang on a minute, that's dreadful, because, you know, the conviction has been quashed because it had to be, but actually the guilty is going free there because of a mistake or error in the process of justice. Right, so we've got that in mind. So now I want to highlight this for you. So this is a really interesting book called Miscarriages of Justice, a review of justice in error. And it's going to be interesting for those of you who are interested in law and criminology. And it was written many years ago by two individuals called Clive Walker and Keir Starmer. Now, hopefully that name Keir Starmer should ring a bell for you, because it is the current Labour leader, not Labour leader, okay? So it is Keir Starmer, and he wrote this book in 1999 with another lawyer. And he defined miscarriages of justice as much more broadly than you and I have been considering in the last few minutes. So he said it's about a failure to achieve the desired end of justice, okay? So quite simply, justice isn't reached, and that can be in all sorts of different ways. And one of the things Starmer particularly highlights is what he calls an individual rights-based approach to interpreting the phenomenon of miscarriages of justice. And therefore, it becomes an extremely broad term. A miscarriage occurs, he argues, whenever suspects or defendants, or indeed convicts, are treated by the state in breach of their rights. So you can be somebody who hasn't been convicted, or you can be in prison and still your rights are being breached. Okay, so any sort of breach of rights is a miscarriage of justice, is what the argument here is. So that means that we can include things like deficient processes. For example, those who are subjected to arrest or detention without due cause. So there's lots of evidence, isn't there? You'll probably be aware to suggest that young black males, for example, are subjected to an unsupportable degree of police attention because of the colour of their skin. And another way of looking at this is through inherently unjust laws, because then again, people's rights would be breached. So at one time, it was illegal in the earlier part of the 20th century to commit a homosexual act. And this really came to light in relation to the computer scientist Alan Turing. And you'll probably know he was responsible for breaking the Nazis' Enigma code during World War II. Now, he was hailed as a national hero for his efforts, but he was also a criminal because he was arrested in 1952 for engaging in a same-sex relationship. And he was offered the chance to escape imprisonment, but only if he was willing to undertake a course of treatment, which essentially amounted to chemical castration. Now, Turing opted for this, and by all accounts, it impacted him psychologically in a dreadful manner, as one would expect. And it's suggested that he committed suicide and was found dead in his bed only a few years later. In 1967, the Homosexuality Act was decriminalised in the UK. Was that an inherently unjust law? Many people would argue it certainly was, and breached some individuals' rights. Therefore, a miscarriage of justice. So the next one is the most obvious one, where there's no factual justification for the applied treatment or punishment of an individual. So that's the person that we've been talking about a lot, a conviction of a person who's innocent. And then there's where you're treated adversely by the state to a disproportionate extent in comparison with the need to protect the rights of others. So what this means is, for example, where you appear in court, you've committed an offence, but the judge has sentenced you to an overly harsh sentence. Okay, it's not in proportion to the crime that you've committed. That would be a breach of your rights, and it would be a miscarriage of justice. And the imposition of conditions, excuse me, during punishment, so in prison, for example, which serve to degrade you, nothing more than degrade you, that can be seen as a miscarriage of justice as well. Your rights are breached. And then lastly, it's the other side of the coin that somebody cleverly brought up earlier on when I asked you what a miscarriage of justice is. So it's where the rights of others are not effectively or proportionately protected or vindicated by state action against wrongdoers. So here we're looking at the victim of crimes side of the story, or if they're a murder victim, then the families of that individual, and they're seeking justice and they're not getting it. And that can be to do with a failure on the part of the criminal justice system through policing and Crown Prosecution Service and so on, to investigate a crime properly, to prosecute, to achieve a conviction. Sometimes it's subtler than that even, to protect victims from known dangers, from known risks in society, a failure even to support victims. Perhaps the police aren't very transparent in their investigation. They can't be completely transparent, but they can tell the victim's family some stuff, for example. All of those sorts of things. All of those are, Starmer and Walker argue, breaches of rights and therefore miscarriages of justice. But I want to focus on wrongful conviction, so the kind of innocent person wrongly convicted, and even that becomes a little bit more complicated when we think about it, because some miscarriages of justice of that nature are what we call double or overlapping miscarriages of justice. So you've got some pictures here in front of you. Okay, so you see a little girl on the far left of your screen, depending on what way you're looking at it. And that is Leslie Molseed. And Leslie was murdered in 1975. And the man in the middle, who's standing there with his mother, is Stefan Kisko. And he was convicted of that murder. He was a very vulnerable individual. And then in 1992, he appealed, and his conviction was eventually quashed at the Court of Appeal. So it was deemed unsafe. Remember, not innocent, okay, but deemed unsafe. So he walked free after that many years in prison. And then the man at the very other far end of the screen, standing in front of a kind of comic book shop, is the real killer of Leslie Molseed. That's Ronald Castry, and he was convicted in 2007 of Leslie's murder. Look at that. From 1975 to 2007, Castry was free, right, in society to do what he wanted to do. And this is the thing where we have this kind of double or overlapping miscarriages of justice. Because at the same time as justice miscarrying in convicting the innocent Stefan Kisko, justice is miscarried as well in allowing the guilty Ronald Castry to go free, to remain free, to commit further crimes, perhaps. Forced, we refer to the work of Forced in relation to this, and he divides these two types of miscarriages of justice that overlap into errors of due process. So these involve unwarranted conviction, so that would be Stefan Kisko, and errors of impunity, which involve a lapse of justice that allow a culpable offender, a responsible offender, a person who's responsible for the act, to remain at large. So that would be Ronald Castry. So errors of due process, Forced argues, can cause errors of impunity. So in other words, if a person is imprisoned for a crime that he or she didn't commit, there's a really good chance that the real offender will remain free to prey on other people. And get this, much research suggests that they actually do. They do prey on other people. So they don't offend once and get away with it. They offend once, get away with it, and offend against many other people then in the meantime. Some miscarriages of justice don't fall into that category. So here you go. A death happens, okay? The police investigate and they decide that that death is murder. An investigation begins even more thoroughly and now focused on catching the criminal, the culprit. A suspect is found and charged and they are convicted essentially. They go to court and a jury finds them guilty of murder. But here's the problem. No one was murdered. How did that happen? Well, the truth is that they died as a result of, for example, a health issue that nobody knew about, an accident, or even suicide. And this usually happens in cases where an individual is wrongly convicted of the murder of someone that they're related to, so a relation of some sort, okay? It also happens in some what we call medico-murder cases. So where, for example, nurses or doctors have been convicted of killing their patients or somebody in their care, but for example, by tampering with a drip, that sort of thing. But actually, subsequently, it's found that there wasn't any tampering that took place. It was an underlying health issue that killed that person and caused sort of different levels of particular toxins to rise in their body, those sorts of things. And I would draw your attention to a case of Colin Norris. That's Norris. Watch that for the next maybe year or so, because that's currently at the Court of Appeal, and he was convicted of the murder of 5 elderly women in a hospital in Leeds. And so if you want to watch a real medico-murder, possible miscarriage of justice in action, have a look at that case, follow it. So these are some examples of people who fall into this category. On the far left-hand side, the lady with the brown hair with her husband is Angela Cannings. In the middle is a lady called Sally Clark. And on the other side of the screen is an elderly lady called Sheila Bowler. And these individuals were all convicted of murdering their relations. In the case of Angela Cannings and Sally Clark, they were convicted of murdering their babies. And Sheila Bowler was convicted of murdering her elderly aunt. Essentially, whilst these women were in prison having been wrongly convicted, there was no guilty person escaping justice. There was no Ronald Castry walking around in society, because no crime happened in the first place. And that's the really important thing to keep in mind. In fact, those ladies' babies died from cot death, and Sheila Bowler's aunt fell to her death, okay? But that was only kind of discovered in retrospect. Okay. So, we are at a situation now where we're thinking about wrongful convictions as miscarriages of justice. And we know now that even that is quite complicated. Wrongful convictions are commonplace across the world, across the globe. They happen everywhere. They happen every day of every month of every week. Every day of every week of every month of every year. They'll always happen to some extent, because the criminal justice system is run by human beings, right? And human beings make mistakes, and also there are also some people that work in the criminal justice system that are not very pleasant people and will engage in illegal acts. So miscarriages of justice have gained much more attention in some countries than others. In America, for example, they've gained a lot of attention because of the threat of the death penalty in some states. So somebody being wrongly convicted, and there's no, repairing that if you've executed them. So the Americans are really interested in miscarriages of justice. In the UK, we are as well, because we've had a lot of high-profile cases that our media have been really interested in kind of revealing and investigating themselves. So these are cases where innocent people have been found guilty of crimes and spent literally decades in prison before they've been released, before their conviction has been quashed. Okay, so we're coming to another question for you now, and you answered the last one brilliantly. So what do you think about this? How do miscarriages of justice happen? So in other words, what are the causes of miscarriages of justice? But this is a kind of double-barreled question, because once you've thought about what they are, I also want you to identify, in your view, what the most common cause of a miscarriage of justice is. So what are the causes, and then out of those, what do you think is the most common cause of miscarriages of justice worldwide? Okay.
Great. So already getting some responses. So Josie is saying witness mistakes. Charlotte, inaccurate eyewitness testimony. Francesca, corrupt policing, media pressure to make conviction, witness mistakes. Annie is saying evidence being tampered with. Stanley, confirmation bias. We've got we've got lots coming through, so I might jump a bit. Mia is saying media influence. Millie, corruption with investigations. Insufficient evidence at the time of the investigation is from Sam. Non-disclosure of evidence from Millie. So lots coming through. One main reason from Reese Heath, mistaken identity. tampering of evidence and bias judgments. I think that's 3 different students that have suggested that. So let's come back to you, Sam. There's plenty coming through there.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, really excellent answers, and all of those are correct actually. And I'm really quite impressed with some of them that I didn't think you'd know about, such as non-disclosure, for example. Yeah, okay, so those were great. I'm not going to spoil the party by getting there before I should. What I want to highlight is that the causes of miscarriages of justice are very difficult to unravel, okay? So you've been really quick in giving me some, but if you look at an individual case, actually trying to disconnect it and kind of pull it apart and find those causes and how they have contributed to the miscarriage of justice is really difficult. So actually what we find is usually there's several causes, happening at the same time in one case. And also we also find a kind of domino effect. So, something will go wrong early on in a case or an investigation, and then it will have a knock-on effect down the line several times. So you get that kind of snowball or domino effect. The causes of miscarriages of justice worldwide are very similar, which is surprising to many people because of the different criminal justice systems that we have. And many of the causes of miscarriages of justice are very, very difficult to reduce or prevent, even with changes to legislation, policy and practice. So we're talking about ingrained, things being ingrained within our criminal justice system that are very difficult to change. So these are just some of the causes of miscarriages of justice, okay? Just some. I'm not going to read them all out to you. I'm going to give you a few seconds to just read that list yourself. And I'll pick out a few for you. So by police investigative decision making, I'm talking about obviously the decisions that take place in policing when perhaps a body's been found, and how the police then go about deciding how they're going to investigate that case. Who sat in a cell next to somebody who's in remand, so they're not in a prison cell in terms of they've been convicted, but they're in a remand prison, so that's prior to trial, but they've been deemed somebody that can't be let out into society until their trial. And so an informant might be a criminal saying, well, I heard that person in the cell next to me say to their cellmate, yes, I did commit that crime. Yeah, so it's that sort of thing, and then they'll come forward to the police or alert the police that they want to give evidence. And there's obviously an issue there because, well, some of the time for doing so, they get the promise of a sentence discount, for example, in their own case. So there's obviously a bit of a kind of carrot, if you like, to give that testimony because you get reward for it. And the media have caused miscarriages of justice as well think about the pressure that the media place on a criminal investigation. They can cause the police to cut corners in terms of their investigative decision making. And that's where I'm talking about it all being mixed up together and crossing and overlapping in terms of the different causes of miscarriages of justice. But your answers were really good. And this is the most common cause of miscarriages of justice worldwide, mistaken eyewitness identification. Okay, so some people got that right, and some people had other answers, but that is the most common cause. So research worldwide indicates that although each miscarriage of justice is triggered by lots of different factors happening often at the same time, mistaken identification evidence continues to be the major cause. And that's quite a shock to many people, partly because of the, the weight that is given to that sort of evidence in a courtroom. In fact, over 75% of death row exonerations to date have been from convictions based on mistaken eyewitness testimony, including mistaken identification. So over 3/4 of those who have been exonerated from death row, who have had their convictions quashed, if you like, fall into that category. So you can see it's a massive problem. And the reason it's a big problem, in part, is because of the trust we have in our own ability to remember things. Okay, so if within a criminal investigation and trial, an important instrument of proof of guilt is that of establishing the culprit's identity visually by eyewitnesses. So, in other words, eyewitness identification is a highly influential component of the justice process. excuse me, it affects every element of it, from the initial police investigation right through to and including the trial. And most professionals, and this includes the police, the CPS, judges, and indeed lay people such as juries, most people view it as compelling evidence in a criminal case. As Casson and Newman say, it is the second most incriminating type of evidence after confession evidence. So after saying, I did it, the next most incriminating type of evidence is somebody saying, that's the person that did it. In other words, pointing to them or identifying them in some other way. Okay, so that idea of that is the person I saw. And identification is really important in the justice process because it can guide the police investigation towards or away from the suspect, and police officers generally tend to believe that eyewitnesses are usually correct. So they have a lot of faith despite knowing a lot of the research findings in this area, which is always quite peculiar. But at trial, when a witness states, that's the person I saw, think about being in a jury and sitting there, and you're one of several people sitting in a jury, and somebody says, that's the person I saw. Why would you doubt that? Why would you doubt that? And that's the key point here. The problem is that despite its weight, the weight that it's given by all professionals involved in the criminal justice system, identification evidence is extremely fallible. Wrongful convictions based upon it are also extremely difficult to rectify. So I'm going to have a look at that fallibility a bit in a moment, but let's move on. So here's an example of somebody who found themselves in that position. This is William Mills. And he was wrongly convicted in 2007 of a bank robbery on identification evidence from 4 eyewitnesses. So 4 separate independent witnesses said, that's the bank robber, that's the person we saw. They were all later proved completely and utterly wrong. But not until he'd been convicted. So, at his trial, the court heard that a robber pointed a handgun at staff and customers in a raid in a bank in Scotland, and they escaped with £8,000 worth of pounds. And Mills was the person that he was the person identified. He denied the offence. He said he was at home at the time, but with his family. But sadly, that's not a great alibi. And eventually, newly discovered DNA evidence led to his conviction being quashed. What would have happened without that DNA evidence? He'd still be there now, for sure. So William Mills is a very good example of somebody who got caught up in that problematic issue of mistaken eyewitness identification. Now, psychological research has been really helpful to us in this area. Right from the 1970s through to today, lots of research still ongoing around witness identification and obviously the issue of performance, because that's important. And through the psychological research that's been undertaken, psychologists have demonstrated that the roots of mistakes made by eyewitnesses lie actually in something quite simple, something we use all the time, every minute that we're awake, human memory. And that alters over time, and it's highly suggestible and it's highly susceptible to error. Anybody who's studying psychology at the moment will know that. So the key thing to remember is that memory, unlike what we think about it or generally think about it, doesn't work like a video recorder. It doesn't record everything that's in front of it and then just replay it. Actually, memory works like a Wikipedia page. So you can go in there after an event and change it, okay, maybe unknowingly, and so can other people by what they say to you, for example. So we can't reliably distinguish between what's a true memory and what's a false memory. And this is really problematic for the criminal justice system. So, why are memories so malleable then? So memory is really, really fragile. And why is that so? Well, that's because memory is not a thing. It is a process. It's an ongoing process. Okay. And it therefore is not fixed, so it's not permanent, and so any memory can and usually is changed from the moment that the information is what we call encoded. So on average, some people are surprised to learn that the chances of you remembering something accurately are no better than you flipping a coin in the air and it landing. Okay? And the most important thing to remember about memory is that confidence has nothing to do with it. So you can be a highly confident eyewitness, and that doesn't match up to the reliability necessarily of what you're saying. Yeah? So you can say, I am 100% sure that that's the person I saw. And that may not, you may be very, very wrong still. So researchers consistently confirmed then that eyewitnesses often perform at a level not better than chance. So imagine that you've been wrongly convicted of murder and have spent the last 20 years in prison. Okay, you've finally had a successful appeal, and the Court of Appeal judges have declared your conviction unsafe. Remember, there's no mention of innocence whatsoever. And you went to the Court of Appeal in the morning, and by the end of the day, after 20 years in prison, you're free to walk out. You've been declared, your conviction has been declared unsafe. And you begin your life again on the outside. Now, my question to you is, what impacts do you think that experience might have had on you? Take a couple of minutes, and what impacts might that wrongful conviction have had on you?
Okay, so Charlotte is suggesting unemployment. That was our first response. Yimika, inability to gain a job, similarly. Casey, less trust in the judicial system and continued sense of imprisonment upon release. Jessica, psychological, depression. We've got loads, damages to your social life, loss of friends. That's from Sam. Meredith, created an anger against the justice system. Francesca, Francesca, as a result, it may lead you to a life of crime due to time in prison, so a change of behaviour. Rachel, people don't see you the same. Yimika, lack of trust from friends and family. Lack of trust from Diana as well. Loss of reputation from Lauren. Can't understand new technology. So that's from Connie. So lots coming through there. A few we've missed. Apologies for that. But back to you, Sam.
That's absolutely excellent. Those are brilliant answers. Much more than I would have imagined would come straight from the top of your head. That's for sure. And that's quite true. All of those are correct. Everything that everybody said. These are the sort of images that we see when people are released after many years in prison, their conviction being quashed. They look really happy, right? But actually, these sorts of images disguise very strong emotions that are inside the individual. And the most important one, the one that overrides almost everything else they're feeling, is anger. So outside, on the outside of that person, you see those lovely photos, elation, happiness, ecstatic. But on the inside, really, anger. And for many victims, that's because the nightmare has only just begun. Imprisonment has often led to them losing all the things you talked about, their job, their home, their family, their friends, lifestyle, financial security, their health. Look at what Paddy Hill, who was wrongly convicted of terrorist offences in the 70s, says. He spent 16 years in prison. He says he'll never recover from the socially harmful effect of his 16 years of wrongful imprisonment, during which his wife divorced him and his children grew up in children's homes. Effectively, he says, I died in prison, even though, of course, he didn't. Michael O'Brien was equally impacted. He was wrongly convicted of the murder of a newsagent in Cardiff in the 1980s. And during his 10 years in prison, he was absent from his son's life and his daughter suffered a cot death. His wife left him, and his father, who was reported to have been absolutely broken by his son's wrongful imprisonment, drank himself to death. Certainly, the individual themselves, when they come out of prison, they come out with no money, no counselling, they've no references, it's very difficult to open a bank account, and you can't get a mortgage. You know, there's this feeling that they don't belong, a strong feeling that they don't belong in society. The psychological harms, for example, are massive with victims of miscarriages of justice. So the exonerated person who comes out of prison, Jenkins researchers found, is very different from the person who went in, suffering severe and lasting psychological harm. So in 2004, a psychiatrist called Adrian Grounds performed several psychiatric tests on 18 UK exonerees, people who had their convictions quashed. And he found irreversible personality change amongst those individuals and post-traumatic stress disorder of the most severe form. He said that their mental state was similar to that of brain damaged accident victims or people who had suffered war crimes. Okay. What about behavioural harms then? Well, imagine you've spent the last 20 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit. You've had this very routinized lifestyle, the same set of rules and requirements that you've been carrying out every single day. You get up at whatever time, you go to bed at every time, you always have your meals at the same time and so on, and your exercise. And suddenly, all of these routines become totally irrelevant when you go to that court of appeal and your conviction is quashed. You walk out the door, and Jenkins says many find it extremely difficult then to fit back in, to connect back to society. And they some experience even lost time, which means that they can only think of themselves as the age that they were when they were convicted. So if you were convicted at, let's say, 16 of murder, and you come out at 36, so your conviction is quashed and you walk from the prison, this is the phenomenon of where you still feel and act like a 16-year-old, okay? And of course that's problematic for fitting back into society when you're not 16. Jenkins also found that victims of miscarriages of justice or wrongful conviction went out of their way to avoid situations involving new people. If quite essentially they couldn't trust strangers. And to block out their problems, many adopted self-destructive behaviours, such as turning to drink and drugs. And emotional harms are severe, they're ongoing, they're profound. Jenkins found that victims find emotional intimacy with their family, who of course have often supported them whilst they're in prison, absolutely impossible. So these individuals come out of prison having been supported by their family, and relationships then break down. The main feeling reported by most, however, in terms of emotion, is anger. It absolutely consumes quashed and being cleared in the courts. They're not cleared in the court of public opinion. This idea of there's no smoke without fire, they must have been involved in some way. And so, as this exoneree in Roberts says, I was exonerated by the courts, but not in the community in which I live. Injustice doesn't just cease because you walk free from the court of appeal.
Sam?
Yeah.
Can I just ask you a question that Molly has raised?
Yeah.
Really, really interesting question. Are the impacts on wrongly convicted prisoners the same as guilty prisoners psychologically when they leave prison?
You're quite right. No, they're not. And the reason for that is that those who are innocent and in prison can't rationalise what's happening to them. So their impacts are much, much stronger than somebody who knows they're guilty of an offence and knows that whilst they might not want to be punished, that their punishment is justified in some way. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Sam.
So physical harms, these can include assaults, torture, brutality by state officials, such as Keith Twitchell, who essentially in the 1980s was tortured until he signed a confession. So physical in that respect. Some individuals report being beaten by prison officers and other prisoners. Some abuse their own bodies, as I've talked about before, and many die actually soon after release because they've had such strong stress-related conditions or developed stress-related conditions that they essentially die from them. And some report being beaten up by the community. That community, they remember, that still doesn't trust them. They don't trust that they didn't do something wrong after their release. Okay. Financial harms. Okay, so it costs over $65,000 to imprison a person. Okay, once police, court costs and all the other things are taken into account. And for every year from then on, it costs another £43,000 per year. So that's a problem, isn't it? If we've imprisoned the wrong person, we're paying out all that money to punish somebody, to keep them imprisoned when they shouldn't be. And a miscarriage of justice also often steals a victim's assets. So financially for them, They lose their job, etc., their house, and so therefore upon release they find themselves with huge financial problems. This is Victor Nealon. After he'd been in prison for 17 years for a rape he didn't commit, he was released with 3 hours notice. He had 3 hours notice that he was going to be released. He was given a train ticket to essentially get out of here and £46. He was homeless, sleeping rough, and or in night shelters. So that's a financial impact for sure. And little help is provided on release. So one of the things people say to me in this sort of situation is, yeah, well, they may be terrible impacts, but these individuals get compensation, right? No, that's wrong. The Criminal Justice and Immigration Act restricted compensation to those who can demonstrate their innocence beyond reasonable doubt. Now, remember, you didn't need to prove your innocence at the Court of Appeal. That's one thing I asked you to remember at the beginning. You just needed to demonstrate that your conviction was unsafe, okay? So that's very different. And it's now, therefore, virtually impossible to get compensation. And in fact, if you do, a government assessor will come along and take money back to cover the fact that during your imprisonment, essentially a roof was put over your head, you were given free board and bed, and your electric was paid for, your meals were paid for, and so on and so forth. So this is Michael O'Brien, who was wrongly convicted of murder. You saw him on another slide, and he was told that the government would be subtracting £37,000 from his £650,000 compensation claim, which he did receive in this case, for his saved living expenses. You've saved a lot of money by us wrongly imprisoning you, is the message. So in conclusion, there are many different forms of miscarriages of justice. The most commonly known form is a wrongful conviction, and you identified that. There are many different causes of miscarriages of justice, and they're very difficult to unravel in each case. But you identified lots of them, didn't you? And many identified mistaken eyewitness identification as the most common cause. The impacts of miscarriages of justice are severe, and they don't match up, actually, with those who are guilty. These are innocent people who have been wrongly imprisoned, and the impacts for them are much more severe and often irreversible. I'd like you to consider coming and learning about this topic more with me on my optional criminology module, Wrongful Convictions in Criminological Context at Aberystwyth. It would be lovely to see you. And that's me done.
Sam, thank you ever so much, and thank you to everyone who's contributed. We have 2 questions, and maybe we can just cover those off before we finish. So Mia is asking, why aren't there laws put in place to help and protect wrongfully convicted prisoners after release?
I think that it's not just that there's not laws put in place, there's very few services at all put in place for them. And I think that's partly because the criminal justice system likes not to admit that it got it wrong. Okay, and this has been obviously going on since the criminal justice system existed, that people have been wrongly convicted. And essentially, I think the position was slightly better, let's say 20 years ago. It was slightly easier to obtain compensation, but now it really isn't. So not only are there no legislation and no services, but there's very rarely compensation. It just is the situation. I would say perhaps, ask those in power in the criminal justice system why they don't really seem to care.
Great, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Mia, for the question. We have a question from Sam as well. How do miscarriages of justice link legally to human rights law? Similarly, I'll just go back to that. Is there punishment for individuals who knowingly contributed in a miscarriage of justice?
Okay, I'll take the second one first. So no, there's hardly any evidence of individuals being punished who have been clearly involved in contributing to bringing about a miscarriage of justice. I'll refer you to doing some research on the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, for example. That was a squad of police officers operating in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, who essentially were involved in the sort of things that I talked about with Keith Twitchell. I'll say allegedly because none of them were convicted. So you see sometimes police officers going on trial in relation to miscarriage of justice cases and nothing comes of it. So I think that's probably the best thing to say on that. And then the other thing was, how does it relate to human rights law? Well, remember, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a criminologist, and that's really important to highlight. So But the way in which it links is perhaps through Starmer and, Walker, their discussion around rights being breached, so a very broad definition of miscarriages of justice. And, if rights are breached, sometimes they are compensatable. But actually, you might say in relation to kind of lower level miscarriages of justice, that's probably more likely, but not when we talk about the things such as murder and rape and so on. Those individuals wrongly convicted of those offences are very rarely compensated.
Great, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Sam. One final question, and then we'll close the session. But Sophia's interested in your opinions on the O.J. Simpson case.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I don't know. The focus of my research and all of my interest is on England and Wales. I think that that what's been decided in the O.J. Simpson case is what's been decided, and I don't think really I should express my own feelings on it. But what I will say is that the focus for young people in particular is skewed towards cases of miscarriages of justice that happen in America. And I think that's possibly because of Netflix and serial podcasts and so on and so forth. But actually what I'm interested in focusing on is something that is only really or rarely brought to attention in this country, which is miscarriage of justice in England and Wales. And I think that's what I want to focus on. And I want to, really kind of continue my research in that area. I think there's a lot of research being done in America and not so much being done in this country, and we need to get that really, going.
Sam, thank you so much for, it was a fascinating talk, and thank you for that, and thank you to everyone for their contributions. But Sam, is there any sort of final thoughts, apart from obviously coming to study with you, Aber, any final thoughts you'd leave the audience with?
Yeah, I'd like them to have a look at the Colin Norris case, please. If you're interested in miscarriages of justice, you'll find that one fascinating because he is deemed to be a serial killer, and he may well not be. And he'll be the first serial killer, if his conviction is overturned, to have that conviction quashed, or those convictions quashed. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the convictions of the Freshwater Five, who are 5 individuals who have been possibly wrongly convicted of cocaine smuggling, and have a look at them. Their case is also at the Court of Appeal now, and it will take a while to find out what happens, but it's a good couple of cases to watch.